Hello, I'm Amanda Walker, and welcome to Inside America, the show that brings you insight and analysis of the biggest issues facing the United States right now. In today's episode, can the US stop an all-out war in the Middle East? Violence continues to escalate across the region with an incessant cycle of retaliation between Israel and Iran-backed groups. So why hasn't America been able to exert its influence on a spiraling situation? The world recently marked 1 year since the October 7th Hamas attacks. Israel's ensuing war in Gaza has led to the loss of over 41,000 lives and a devastating humanitarian crisis. It's also catalyzed a widening regional conflict with the Israeli offensive in Lebanon against Hezbollah and retaliation from Iran. With less than a month until the US election, there is a diplomatic scramble to avoid a full-scale war. Presidential candidate Kamala Harris is still walking a fine line on Gaza, while her rival Donald Trump continues to assert that there would be no conflict whatsoever on his watch. Coming up, we ask a former ambassador why the US hasn't used its leverage to pressure Israel to stop.
There is no American politician in Washington right now who is willing to challenge Israel's right to do whatever Israel deems necessary to defend itself.
Now, just over a year ago, there was real optimism surrounding a US-Saudi deal to normalize relations with Israel and end hostilities with its Arab neighbors. Then October 7th happened. And since then, the US has been largely ineffective in using any of its influence. US leverage in Israel is clearly waning. The deadly and devastating attacks on Gaza go unchecked, with Israel continuing to undermine US calls for a ceasefire. Israel did appear to be taking some heed of US pleas not to attack Hezbollah and Lebanon. But that all changed in September, with the device attacks of Hezbollah pagers and walkie-talkies, killing at least 42 people and wounding thousands. Then came even greater escalation, with the assassination of Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah. In response, Iran unleashed a barrage of missiles, providing fodder for Donald Trump's continued criticism of the Biden-Harris administration as weak.
The leaders of other countries think that they're weak and incompetent, and they are. They're grossly incompetent.
Iran has acted very badly.
In 2018, while President Donald Trump's withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal was widely criticized by allies, Democrats say it has ultimately made Iran more dangerous.
We had a coalition of nations that had boxed Iran's nuclear program in, the inability to advance it. Donald Trump pulled that program and put nothing else in its place. So Iran is closer to a nuclear weapon than they were before because of Donald Trump's fickle leadership.
Kamala Harris went further with her answer to a recent question about America's greatest adversary.
I think there's an obvious one in mind, which is Iran. Iran has American blood on their hands, okay? This attack on Israel, 200 ballistic missiles. What we need to do to ensure that Iran never achieves the ability to be a nuclear power, that is one of my highest priorities.
Showing how much the Middle East conflict has shifted US foreign policies. The Biden administration continues to pledge allegiance to Israel, despite mounting political pressure. All eyes are on the extent of Israel's response to Iran. While supporting its right to defend itself, President Biden has urged restraint. The diplomatic scramble to avoid all-out war is on.
The United States has made clear, along with the G7, the European Union, partners in the Gulf, so many other regions, that we believe the way forward is through diplomacy, not conflict.
But with a prolonged lack of any real progress, America's global position is weakening by the day. So let's take a closer look at what options the US has. Robert Ford is a former ambassador to Syria and a fellow at the Middle East Institute. I asked him if the US can prevent all-out war.
I don't think the United States has an ability to fully constrain either Israel or Iran, but it does have influence, certainly with the Israelis, and probably can generate with other countries influence on Iran to slow or perhaps limit exchanges between Israel and Iran. First, with Israel, it will be exceptionally important for the Biden administration to use more leverage than mere verbal urgings, verbal advice. And that probably means explaining to the Israelis that the American government will not accept Israel using American weaponry in a large-scale attack on Iran. And at the same time, sending a message to the Iranians, delivered, I think, with other regional states that would include Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and Iraq, that there is an overall effort to limit exchanges between Israel and Iran. The Iranians have made their point with their last attack, and any Israeli reprisal needs to be limited, much as it was in April. And then there needs to be a broader discussion about how to de-escalate and move to a ceasefire in Lebanon first, and then eventually, we hope, in Gaza.
So the US still has influence, but in terms of the options that are out there, why haven't we seen specific action or any kind of real meaningful progress in the US using that influence?
Oh, well, that's quite simple. There is no American politician in Washington right now, no politician with any substantial amount of authority, who is willing to challenge Israel's right to do whatever Israel deems necessary to defend itself. There is very much a blank check policy coming to the Israeli government from the American government.
And how much does that have to do with the fact that we are mere weeks away from a US election?
I think it's a factor, but I don't think it's actually the most important factor. There has been, over the past years, more and more, a sense in the United States that Israel needs to determine what Israel should do to defend itself, and the Americans have no role second-guessing the Israelis, nor should the Americans threaten Israel with limitations on American transfers of military hardware and ammunition, such things, that all of these things are out of bounds. This is a point of view which frankly did not exist in the United States as recently as 25 years ago, but right now is very much standard among the entire Republican Party and a substantial portion, not all, but a substantial portion of the Democratic Party. There is, of course, a left wing of the Democratic Party which is urging the White House now to do more to pressure Israel in material terms, but they are very much a minority. The friends of Israel in the Congress and in the administration are far more powerful than those who want a more, how would I say it, muscular policy towards the Israelis. But there's silence from Washington. There's no political will to confront Israel and its friends by the majority of the Democratic Party or the Republican Party.
And Kamala Harris has been walking a fine line when it comes to pushing for a ceasefire and being a bit more critical of Israel. But do you think that is just rhetoric at the end of the day? Do you see much difference between her and Biden's approach?
It would be difficult for Kamala Harris to break entirely with Joseph Biden during this campaign because she is the vice president. And for a variety of reasons, both political and protocol, she cannot do that. But at the same time, I have, for example, seen no leaks in reporting out of Washington, and Washington is a town full of political leaks. I've seen no leaks suggesting a sharp disagreement between her and her advisors and the Biden team, the president, the National Security Council staff, about what to do on Gaza. I've heard Kamala Harris express sympathy for Palestinian civilian losses. I've heard President Biden express that too. For the most part, Kamala Harris hews very closely to President Biden's policy. She, in a sense, has to, but I don't get much sense from her, even watching her campaign, that she's prepared to go in a dramatically new direction. She's very hesitant, for example, to meet with pro-Palestinian groups herself. She finally agreed to meet a group called Engage, which is a Muslim American political lobby group. This was the first time she'd agreed to do that, and that's, in a sense, because the polling numbers out of states like Pennsylvania and Michigan are close, and she has a political need to reinforce her base with many American Muslims who are dissatisfied with what the Biden administration is doing and what Kamala Harris is saying.
Robert Ford, former US ambassador to Syria there, saying that Kamala Harris has been late to the game when it comes to the American Muslim vote. Let's discuss that further with our guests. I'm joined today by Ibrahim Al-Asil, who is from the Middle East Institute, and Natasha Hall, who's from the Center for Strategic and International Studies Middle East Program. Thank you both for joining us today. Natasha, let me start with you. Do you agree with that? Has Kamala Harris been too late when it comes to voicing her concerns over Gaza and appealing to the Arab American vote?
I would actually say it's the reverse. I think that Kamala Harris came a little bit too early to the game. So she benefited from the change of tone, the initial speech that she gave, which I think seemed very sympathetic to those that have been frustrated with the Biden administration and its efforts or non-efforts in Gaza. But now they're waiting for what's tangible. What is she tangibly going to be doing different from the Biden administration? And unfortunately, I don't think that the Kamala Harris campaign can really say too much to that. And so I think as a result, you're seeing a lot of the Muslim and Arab vote who was willing to give her a try, sort of moving back towards either being uncommitted or a third-party candidate.
And Ibrahim, I think that idea of sympathy has been there from Kamala Harris, but it's not enough, is it?
I agree with that. I think it's been there, but it's not enough. And of course, also to add and to build on what Natasha just eloquently said, I think Kamala Harris's position also has two inherent disadvantages. That the first one, she is not a decision maker at the point, but yet she is seen as part of the administration. But the VP in the United States has no real power. The other one, that it's also a campaign season, that she is campaigning. She can give promises, but she cannot necessarily probably keep them, and people know that. But generally, I think she hasn't been doing what she should be doing, and at least meeting with those people, talking to them, many of the constituency who wants to hear something more serious about what she would like at least to do if she is the president of the United States.
Now, you've both been across this for years, and you've been Middle East watchers. We know it's dominating US policy as we head into the election now. But I want to get from both of you, starting with you, Natasha. It's an often volatile situation, but where are you putting now in terms of what we've seen over the last decades? Where is this on the urgency level?
I mean, it's more urgent than we've ever seen it before. If you just look at the number of trips by those from the White House, from the Secretary of State, this is unlike anything that we have seen in recent years, despite the fact that we've seen a lot of protracted conflicts that haven't really gone anywhere, from Syria to Yemen to Gaza and the Palestinian territories themselves. But I think there was this feeling amongst, especially this administration, but previous ones as well, that you could sort of sidestep these protracted conflicts in favor of elite bargains, sort of like the Abraham Accords, and just move forward on those issues that seemed to be more manageable. And I think October 7th and everything that we've seen since in terms of regional escalation, really across the board in the Middle East now, really calls that strategy into question. So without a doubt, I think the likes of Russia and China are quite happy with the distraction of this US administration that has so eagerly wanted to pivot to focusing on Ukraine and China and other issues.
And Ibrahim, do you agree with that notion that this is kind of a bit different this time around?
Absolutely, it's different. It's much bigger. It's very brutal, and we're talking about 6 states. We're talking about Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Yemen, and the Palestinian territories. 6 states plus the Palestinian territories where this war is taking place. And Syria has been also overlooked in all of this image, where actually there is ongoing fighting. There are every few days an Israeli airstrike inside Syria, and also the Iranian and the Iranian-backed militias are also using the Syrian territories. So this is a huge, and we don't know where this is going. It seems that by the day it's getting bigger when we talk about the scope and the depth of the conflict, and it might take any further direction or any more escalations in the near and the far future.
And Natasha, we see obviously the speeches, but what do you think is going on here in Washington? Because it is a diplomatic rush now, isn't it, to try and get something together? I mean, an election time, you never want this kind of unrest at home. You don't want it internationally. You don't want it anywhere. So what is going on, would you guess at, behind the scenes?
I mean, that's the billion-dollar question, right? What's happening behind the scenes? Because you see a lot of overt public statements by the Biden administration officials, by Biden himself, about what they would like to see, but then you see the Israeli government doing almost entirely the opposite. And I think recently you've seen a little bit more openness on that with regards to the war going on in Lebanon now with Hezbollah, where finally administration officials have been open about the fact that they are supportive of this effort. And I think that that's in large part because they probably see it as a PR victory as well. To move, just like Israel does, wants to move the conversation away from the horrific situation in Gaza and towards something that is a bit more tactical, more strategic, like the war with Hezbollah and Iran, which I think we can all see now that was the thing that Israel had been preparing for all these years. It had not been anything on their southern flank. And so they would like to show off, I think, a bit with regards to that. But in terms of the diplomatic negotiations behind the scenes, it's really hard to tell. I think they've given up on a ceasefire, to be totally honest, before the election. And it's unclear to me how that's going to affect the election itself and Kamala Harris's chances. If things get further inflamed, it's hard to imagine how they'll get more inflamed than they already are. But we're still waiting for that Israeli retaliation on Iran. So the possibilities are really, unfortunately, I think, endless.
And Ibrahim, can you offer us any insights from the kind of Israel perspective? What is the game plan here? Are they now just ignoring those pleas for restraint from the US? Is that just not even something they're listening to now?
That's total ignorance, and we can tell that Prime Minister Netanyahu sees an opportunity. When we talk about the context of the war and the timing of the war, the global events, the United States and the ongoing elections, also what's happening in the region, and the weakness that's been also exposed on the Iran side and the Iranian-backed side, it seems like Prime Minister Netanyahu wants to keep escalating. And this is very dangerous because, again, we're talking about 6 countries and we don't know what the outcome that this Israeli government wants to see. We're also very concerned about Jordan as well. If the West Bank, if things escalate in the West Bank, and also if there is more escalations inside Lebanon, inside Syria, at some point there might also be some destabilizing factors inside Jordan, and the humanitarian situation is pretty bad, and people have no place to go. We see now people inside Gaza have been displaced multiple times. Also, when you look at the bigger pictures, we have the displaced people inside Lebanon and the Syrian refugees who were in Lebanon. Now they are displaced going back to Syria. Many of them are taking very long journey to avoid areas under the regime control because it's not safe for them. So as long as there is no de-escalation and ceasefire, things won't stay the same. There will be an escalation every day and every week and every month, and probably will reach an all-out war in the region where nobody really can control.
So with that notion of total escalation in mind, what can the US do? What leverage does it have at this point, Natasha?
I think it has a lot of leverage. It just hasn't chosen to use it. And so I don't think we can really understand what the limits of that leverage are until we actually see it in play. And we just haven't seen this administration really want to use that to bring a ceasefire to a finishing point on Gaza. And so I think they've sort of reluctantly agreed with the Israeli government that they would also like to de-link Gaza from the war with Hezbollah. And in order to do that, they're going to strike at Hezbollah directly. But unfortunately, that means, as Ibrahim pointed out, a really devastating situation in Gaza. And I think that, for the most part, you can understand why Netanyahu is doing this. He went from being a politician on death's doorstep, just a year ago, to potentially, they're saying that he might win a re-election if it happened today. So, I mean, you really see sort of the political adroitness of Netanyahu himself in this. And so it's difficult to understand how this would play out to a close by the time we reach the election.
And Ibrahim, what card should the US be playing now? They want a ceasefire, we keep hearing that, but what can they do specifically to achieve that?
I think at least try to limit the violence and focus on civilian protection. That's something doable, and the US is not doing it the way it should. And when we talk about leverage in the strategic sense, a leverage is use it or lose it. You can't just activate it whenever you want. And the United States is losing its leverage, because sooner or later we will reach a point where even if the United States genuinely wants to use that leverage, it might be too late because of the regional factors and the regional context. So this is very important, not only for the region and the Middle East, with all its importance from different dimensions, but also for the United States and its ability to use leverage on its allies and partners when it needs to. It's losing it, and this is going to be, the consequences are going to be severe for a very long time.
Yeah, so Natasha, what about that? The idea of America losing its influence, losing its ability to have a role in these kinds of situations. What message does that send to the likes of Russia and China?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point from Ibrahim. I mean, I think unfortunately we've seen sort of this false choice between a total arms embargo on Israel and then just carte blanche. And there are so many things in between that the United States can do in terms of the type of weapons, in terms of having 2 carrier strike groups in the region to prepare for any kind of offensive. There have been times that U.S. presidents and this president has called Netanyahu or called whoever was in Israel and said, if you do this, we won't be behind you, right? But I think we're at this point, as Ibrahim pointed out, that this is their war. So anything that Israel does at this point, it needs to be looked at as defending it, right? Or it loses all of its cards that it's been building up for decades within Israel. And so that's a really dangerous place to be for the United States, because that means it has to be behind Israel no matter what escalation it chooses. And that's been a terrifying prospect for the past few months, but I can tell you within the national security establishment, it had been scary even before October 7th.
And throughout the course of the last year, the kind of coverage of what's been happening, it seemed to be very much humanitarian focused at the beginning. Now we're all talking much more about retaliation and who's going to do what. But the humanitarian crisis is still incredibly real. It's a difficult thing to summarize, but I'm going to ask you to do it, please, Ibrahim.
Oh, absolutely. So the refugees, the number of refugees is multiplying and increasing very rapidly every day. The access for food and let alone safety, but also food and medicine, which is also something very dangerous, especially when we talk about Gaza. Gaza is the most dire situation at the point, but also I would like to mention that this war could not only go for months, this could go for years. And this could really become something that nobody can control. And I feel that this is not being taken seriously in Washington, D.C. on the humanitarian level, on the security level, on the strategic level. And we see that going and happening and escalating day by day. And finally, I also want to highlight the situation in the West Bank as well, where things are becoming too tense and they might explode at any point, and that would also jeopardize the security of Jordan. And then we'll look at a region where from Iran to Iraq and then Syria and then Jordan, Palestinian territory, and Israel and Lebanon, open space, open region for war where other countries might also intervene. And we look at not only millions of refugees, but tens of millions of refugees.
Okay, and Natasha, just very briefly, unfortunately, we're running out of time. We can't not talk about the election. It's weeks away. To what extent do you think the outcome of the US election will influence the situation in the Middle East?
I mean, it could dramatically affect the situation in the Middle East, but we really don't know because former President Trump is so unpredictable in this regard. There's a potential for him to feel embarrassed by Netanyahu's admonishments and suddenly reject support, right? But I think with regards to this issue in particular, a lot of people, once they get into the White House, do have to color in the lines, right? And so there's very little that they can do sort of outside of that. But I think in terms of the humanitarian crisis, there's a big difference between both candidates here. And so I suspect that the bigger differences will probably be on Ukraine, but in the Middle East, time will tell. Yeah.
Okay. Natasha, Ibrahim, thank you both.
Thanks for having me.
So the US is walking a diplomatic tightrope as we career towards one of the most consequential elections in recent history. So much to discuss. Do join us next time on Inside America.